Good afternoon. My name is Linda Swain. On behalf of the FSU School of Information and my co-host Amy Reese and Luke Weaver, I would like to welcome you to the summer's lecture, Tell Me Sweet Little Lies, Racism, Bias Confirmation, and the Disinformation Epidemic, presented by Dr. Nicole A. Cooke, Augusta Baker Endowed Chair, and Associate Professor at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Cooke will be introduced by Dr. Michelle Kasmer, Professor, School of Information, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Faculty Advancement for the College of Communication and Information. It's all yours, Michelle.
Thank you, Linda, so much. And of course, I'm going to repeat some of what you just said because it's important and because Dr. Cooke is awesome. So first of all, thank you. I am incredibly grateful for the opportunity to introduce one of the most important scholars working in our field. And then of course, I was going to say today, and then I realized actually it's ever, Dr. Nicole Cooke. Dr. Cooke is the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair and an Associate Professor in the School of Information Science at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Cooke has earned bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from Rutgers University, as well as a master's from Penn State University. Dr. Cooke's contributions to critical cultural information studies, fake news, misinformation, and disinformation, and diversity and social justice in librarianship have made their impact felt throughout education and practice. She has a large number of influential publications, but I want to call out two. I note particularly her article called GSLS Carnegie Scholars, Guests in Someone Else's House, published in Libraries, Culture, History, and Society in 2017, in part because I was at the conference presentation she gave of an early version of that paper, and it was one of the only standing ovations I've ever seen for a conference paper that wasn't a keynote presentation. It's ridiculously amazing. I also note particularly her book, Information Services to Diverse Populations, Developing Culturally Competent Library Professionals, which has been adopted widely and has shaped in important and positive ways how we prepare librarians. Dr. Cooke, of course, has taken on leadership roles in professional associations, including, for example, leading the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Accelerator track associated with the 2020 annual meeting of the Association for Information Science and Technology, as well as the Elise Equity and Social Justice SIG. Dr. Cooke's work has been recognized through many awards, including the 2016 ALA Equality Award, the 2017 ALA Achievement in Library Diversity Research Award, the Illinois Library Association's 2019 Intellectual Freedom Award, and the Association for Library and Information Science Education's 2019 Excellence in Teaching Award. Cool. She is a greatly in demand speaker, and we are extraordinarily grateful that she made the time to share her knowledge and expertise with us today. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Nicole Cooke for her talk, Tell Me Sweet Little Lies, Racism, Bias, Confirmation, and the Disinformation Epidemic.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I just want to thank Linda and the team for this wonderful invitation. And I just want to give a special shout out to Michelle, Kathy, and Gary, who have known me since I was a baby doc student in LIS and have always been amazingly supportive of me and my work. So it is an honor to be here with you today. So what I want to talk about today is racialized misinformation and disinformation. And so a lot of my work in my career as a faculty member has been about equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice, and also doing information behavior work specifically around misinformation and disinformation. And so, as you can see, in the last maybe 3 years or so, I've been really trying to bring them together. And it was, actually a little bit of a thought process for me because I had previously been working in these two areas separately, right, and not bringing them together. And the more that I thought about it, I was thinking, yeah, these two really do work together. So today will just be examples of these three articles and some of the things that I've been working on. So just so we're all on the same page, and I'm sure that we are, the definitions that I use for misinformation and disinformation, I pull from firstdraft.org, which is a really great site. And they really talk extensively about the typology of fake news, but more importantly, misinformation and disinformation. And they talk about it as information disorders, and fake news falls within that. And so they talk about misinformation, which is simply false information that is spread in a variety of different ways and contexts. Disinformation is also false information, but is deliberately false. Like someone is creating this information to deceive and mislead. And so, you know, when we first started talking about fake news in a much larger scale after the 2016 presidential election, there were exposés and articles by NPR and The Atlantic and some other publications talking about how they actually talked to people who worked in fake news and disinformation farms, right? And by farms just means, you know, big cubicles. And the people, their job is to actually create disinformation, because disinformation creates money and creates clicks and likes and things that are commodified and valued in today's society. And in particular, I want to focus today in particular on malinformation, which is a more extreme form of disinformation. And this is information that is created deliberately to deceive and mislead, like disinformation. But malinformation can be really horribly harmful, right? And as we'll talk about, it can lead to people being arrested. It could be, you know, information that's criminalized and can really cause harm and even death. And so that is the type of information that we'll be talking about today when we're talking about our information disorders. So I have a couple of slides here, and I want to just go through some examples. Some of these you may have seen, others may be new to you, but I promise there is a point to all of these images. So top left, we have a Dancing with the Stars dancer, and I think later judge, who is in a Halloween costume in blackface. And every Halloween, I don't know about you all at FSU, but in every place I've been, every Halloween, we have students in blackface, you know, for Halloween and other occasions. The middle of the screen, these were two young women who were single moms at different universities. And they both happened to take pictures breastfeeding their young children at their graduations. Now, the young white woman on the right was widely lauded and said, "Isn't this amazing?" And she, you know, handled all of this, her coursework, and she had a job, and she was a single mom, and, you know, she's sharing this moment with her child. Almost the exact same picture for an African-American woman. Oh, how inappropriate. Why would she do that at graduation? Like, no one wants to see that. And so already we're seeing the discrepancies in how people of color, specifically African Americans, are treated in the media. Top right, we have a picture of the great late Rosa Parks. And this was tweeted out by the Republican National Convention, and essentially saying, well, you know, we're celebrating Rosa Parks, who successfully ended racism in the United States. Bottom right, we have one of many caricatures of President Obama and Michelle Obama presented in a negative light. And it, you know, it is often the case that the Obamas were portrayed as monkeys or apes or other unflattering characteristics, associated stereotypes, if you will, to African Americans. Bottom middle, and you can do this on Google or another search engine at any time. Unfortunately has not changed a whole lot. But this went around specifically in 2016, and then it comes up frequently since then. But if you Google unprofessional hair or hairstyles, you'll get pictures of Black women or women of color. If you similarly do a search for professional hairstyles, you'll have pictures of white women. And, you know, we see this in our society with the Crown Act in various states and things where it is said that employers are no longer allowed to discriminate against their employees based on their hairstyles. And in particular, this would be for Black women and women of color who want to wear their hair naturally. And then bottom left, this is Sweet Brown. And I don't remember what city this was, but she was on the news and the apartment building that she lived in had a fire, and they took this clip, and she was saying, about this fire, nobody has time for that. And this, really launched into a meme. It launched several songs. And really what this is coming down to is that this is considered to be digital blackface. All right, so just like in the top left, we have physical blackface, there is also a digital version, right? And how we're using different memes and jokes to demean people of color. So a couple of more examples. We have LeBron James on the cover of Vogue. And this cover was widely criticized because it gives, again, this idea that he is King Kong saving this white woman or white model in this case. And so again, this idea that African Americans are portrayed as animals, as apes, in this very masculine, almost non-human way. And similarly, on the right, we have a caricature of Serena Williams, arguably one of the best athletes of our time, who is also consistently portrayed as angry and aggressive and ape-like and non-human. Okay, so these are some of the pictures that are coming out about our athletes as well. We could have a whole session on how Muslims are depicted in the media. All right, and so if we have just a picture of a Muslim, particularly one that covers their head in religious observance, that tends to elicit, particularly in the media and popular culture, that they're terrorists and that they're radicalized and that they're Al-Qaeda or that they're ISIS or that they're all of these things. And then we have a little still shot from Disney's Aladdin and how Arab and Muslim people are consistently portrayed as violent, as killers, as the enemy, as the villain, etc. And so this is another example of how people of color are depicted in the media. This is Caster Semenya, and Caster is a South African runner who is widely awarded one of the fastest runners globally. And she has a hormonal disorder that gives her more testosterone. And she was going to be banned from certain races and things of that nature because the organization was trying to say that she had an unfair advantage. And so Fox News ran with this and said, transgender runner loses court appeal. Caster Semenya is not transgender. So this kind of very blatant dog whistling and fear mongering, right? Because transgender people are very widely discriminated against. So instead of just saying runner loses court appeal, the headline went a step further and tried to, suggest and fear monger and try to, really bring out the worst in folks who have discriminatory thoughts about folks in the trans community. So this is, as I mentioned, disinformation and malinformation. This is one of the more blatant examples of that because this is just a flat out lie. And, as we know with a lot of this information, even if it is corrected, it's very unlikely that we're going to see it, or it's very unlikely that the correction or the redacted or retracted information will go wide. So there are probably still a lot of people who may have seen this particular story or read this story and may still think that Caster Semenya is transgender when she is not. We have, excuse me, a picture here of Michael Brown, who was killed in police custody in Ferguson, Missouri in 2015. And there was a lot of discussion about Michael Brown's death, not only because of the circumstances, but also because of the pictures that the media continue to use when talking about this story. And so on the right, you have a picture of him, just out and about in the neighborhood. And there were other pictures of him with headphones or a hoodie. And these pictures were designed to make him look menacing. and look like, to go with the story that claims that he was stealing from the convenience store. And that's why the police were called. And ultimately, he lost his life in that encounter. However, it was just maybe a week before his death that he graduated from high school. And you have the picture of him in his cap and gown. And so the question and part of the discussion became, why isn't this picture being used? Why can't we portray him in a positive light? And this happens all the time, right? In the media, in the newspaper, on television, in movies, et cetera. And so this particular instance spurred a hashtag campaign, "If They Gun Me Down." And it's really enlightening. And if you have any interest, you could probably still put the hashtag in and have some examples come up. People, particularly people of color, were posting pictures of themselves on social media, their formal pictures and also their informal pictures. And there were folks from the military. There were business people that work corporate jobs in three-piece suits and saying, if you saw me in the suit versus if you saw me dressed to go to a basketball game, which picture would you use if you wanted to talk about me in the media? So really, really important and really necessary to break down these images. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Recently, doctors and medical professionals, particularly after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, again, at the hands of police, medical professionals started saying, we need to do something. We need to care about Black lives as well. There is a lot of literature that says that medical professionals think that African Americans, people of color, have a higher pain tolerance. And therefore, they don't treat them the same. They don't prescribe the same medications. And really, this idea of Black people are inhuman, right? And so, a lot of the work that I've done in my career is about cultural competence. And cultural competence is this idea that we are supposed to be seeking out the differences of other people, celebrating them, prioritizing them. And what is always ironic to me is that cultural competence originated in the applied health sciences. So medicine, nursing, counseling, social work, et cetera. So these concepts are coming out of this field, out of these fields, and we still have a problem of maternal death rates are so much higher in African American communities. It is widely known that there are medical deserts as well as food deserts, right? So similar concepts in that people of color are not afforded the same type of healthcare. We are now still in a global pandemic, and Brown and Black people are dying and being infected at disproportionate rates with the COVID-19 virus, right? So we see this over and over again. And what's happening at the level at which our medical professionals are not actually viewing people of color as humans worthy of solutions and being healed. All right, so I couldn't resist including Harry and Meghan. Some of you, if you haven't seen it, you've probably heard about this interview where Meghan Markle, who is biracial but does identify as a Black woman, was essentially talking about not only the racism that she experienced in the UK, partially, as part of this kind of machine that is the royal family, but also as a result of the UK tabloids who that are known to be particularly vicious. And so, a lot of people are saying, well, she deserves what she gets. She's not telling the truth. It doesn't matter, et cetera, et cetera. But it was interesting to kind of listen to the progression of how she was talking about the disinformation and malinformation that's coming out of the UK tabloids. And so, for example, the interview started out with her saying there were all of these headlines saying that Meghan made Princess Kate cry. And she said, that it was actually the opposite and that the palace refused to correct that story, right? So that was the first example of perhaps willful disinformation. And, on the scale of seriousness, it probably hurt her feelings, but it wasn't really serious. But as she continued to give examples, she admitted that she was actually suicidal. And so that was a very significant and very telling result of disinformation and malinformation, right? Because as I'll show you in a little bit, when we have microaggressions and ill treatment of people of color, these things add up and they can be very stressful. They can have very severe cumulative effects. Not only the effects are that our stereotypes persist, but also you have someone, and I'm sure she's completely not the only one, who has felt less than or othered or marginalized, and sadly felt suicidal because of this false information and how it perpetuates and how it makes people feel. All right, and so just to kind of, ramp up in terms of examples, this is another example of malinformation. This is a deliberately misleading sign that was found in Scotland, specifically about Black Lives Matter, equating it to Antifa and perpetuating this stereotype and this piece of disinformation that Black Lives Matter stands for killing white people on sight. And that is patently not true. And there have been studies and statistics that said 93% of Black Lives Matter protests that happened after the death of George Floyd were completely peaceful. And the ones that had violence, these were people that were coming in after the Black Lives protesters left because of curfews and other restrictions placed on them. But the folks that were breaking windows and throwing Molotov cocktails and things of that nature were not actually the Black Lives Matter protesters, right? So this is a piece of disinformation and malinformation that could actually get someone killed, much less arrested or detained or profiled. All right, so I don't want anyone to think that any of this is new, right? Everything old is new again. And so, we are currently in the global pandemic dealing with a lot of xenophobia and a lot of violence and hatred towards people of Asian descent because a former politician referred to COVID-19 as the China virus or Kung flu virus, which, I would only say in the context of a presentation. I do consider those to be slurs. And that is deliberate disinformation and malinformation. And as a result of people hearing these slurs over and over and over, we have to have new initiatives like stopaapihate.org and other things, because people are literally being stabbed and attacked and hospitalized by people who don't like the way that they look because they're perceived to be carriers of the virus. All right, and so on this particular screen, we have Asian, Japanese in particular, women and Japanese people who were detained in Japanese internment camps, right? So now we're talking about it as forced migration. But there are so many pictures, and this digital collection at San Jose State is really fascinating because they're all smiling, right? So this is propaganda at its finest, right? So we're going to detain these people, but we don't want you to think that it's, anything malicious or they want to go, right? So that's what these images and this type of information was trying to portray. When really what we have is the picture on the right, where the Japanese were being blatantly discriminated against and kept out of different neighborhoods and different places, and instead put into these horrible camps. All right, so this is Stop AAPI Hate that I mentioned to you earlier. This is a recent campaign about what's happening to folks of Asian descent around the country and around the world. And on the bottom here, we have a really, stupid example of how these stereotypes really kind of trickle down into this casual, everyday racism that is equally destructive and maintains the status quo and maintains the stereotypes. So we have an example of COVID mac and cheese. Our homemade mac and cheese topped with Chinese chili garlic sauce. All right, so again, lazily relying on this stereotype that Chinese people and people of Asian descent are carriers and perpetuators of the coronavirus. All right, so we see this information in advertising, we see it in menus, so we see it, we're surrounded by this information and these types of stereotypes. All right, so the reason that I wanted to show you all of these examples was to really emphasize how often we encounter this type of information. And sometimes we'll see it and we're not even really cognizant of it, but we are surrounded by this type of malinformation. And I am suggesting that racism and stereotypes are a form of malinformation. And we need to be more cognizant, we need to be more proactive about this information, this malinformation that we see. We need to call it out. We need to correct it. We need to be having these conversations with our children and with our students, with our information professionals and whomever, to say, this is no longer acceptable. And we as information providers and educators need to figure out how we're going to reverse this trend. Now, we may not be able to defeat it completely, but we can certainly have more critical conversations about it. So Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is a rock star in the field of education, in particular, culturally responsive pedagogy, she says that we teach what we value. Okay, and I would also suggest that we research what we value, right? And it just becomes this catch-22, this continuous cycle of, we are socialized and conditioned in the West to value whiteness, to value maleness, to value affluence, to value Christianity, to value able-bodied and able-minded individuals, and other things that are within those norms. And anyone and anything that exists outside those norms are very easily marginalized, othered, dismissed, devalued, etc. And so we need to reverse that, and we need to be looking outside of those boxes, and we need to be prioritizing these very different perspectives, diverse perspectives and voices, and things that really add more value to what we're doing. And just as further example, with this idea of being socialized or being conditioned, please don't think that our children don't know what racism is or don't know what difference is. And again, these are historical examples. We have the brown doll test that was done several decades ago, where they hold up dolls of different colors to children of color and also to white children. And inevitably, the children go for the white dolls because the white dolls are perceived as better, or they're perceived as nice, or whatever values the children have been conditioned to associate with white skin versus darker skin. And similarly, Jane Elliott did an experiment in her classroom with young children the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And it's the blue eye, brown eyes experiment. And essentially the experiment was, she told the children that those with blue eyes would receive extra perks or would receive better treatment, and the children with the brown eyes would be excluded from all of that. And the reaction that she received, not only from the children, but from the parents and from the community, was, well, how dare you try to exclude one segment of your class versus the other? And her point is, this is what happens with people of color, right? But when she did this example, it was very clear that the students with the blue eyes were readily waiting to accept their perks, and were very easily convinced that they deserve things that children with brown eyes did not deserve, right? So this is still part of the conditioning and the socialization that lead to or perpetuate our stereotypes, microaggressions, our implicit biases, etc. All right, so another example is Kelly Marie Tran. And Kelly is in the Star Wars franchise, and you can see that she is of Asian descent. And when she was cast in Star Wars, she received an inordinate amount of hate mail and nasty messages and things of that nature, because people said that she didn't belong in Star Wars, because Star Wars should be white. And that's what people wanted, and that's what they were used to, and they didn't want anything different. And so she was driven off of social media because of the harassment. And she wrote a really beautiful op-ed, and she has been quoted as saying, "The world tells people that they don't belong through subconscious messages in the media. These messages reinforce that women need to buy products such as mascara, for example, to feel beautiful and worthy of love." But in this previous slide, she also kind of concludes this by saying that it took her 3 years to kind of do some of this internal work and realize that the haters and those who were harassing her were all wrong, right? And that it wasn't the words, it's that she started to believe them. And so this is another nod, if you will, to this socialization and conditioning. And, you know, think back to Meghan Markle and others. If you are constantly bombarded with these stereotypes that you are less than or that you should be othered, you might actually start to believe that malinformation. So just really quickly, because I could also do workshops on all three of these things here on the screen with you as well. This part of us talking about stereotypes and racism as a form of malinformation. I've mentioned the conditioning and socialization, right? And part of this is implicit bias. And this conditioning and this socialization of what we value versus what we don't, this runs in our minds unconsciously, implicitly. And when we see things and we see people, we assign values to them based on these implicit biases. And we need to start identifying these implicit biases and trying to correct and reverse them. Now, as part of that, I've mentioned to you stereotypes. These are these widely adopted beliefs about certain individuals or groups based on their behaviors, appearances, etc. And then as another part of this dimension, we have microaggressions, and I'm sure you've all heard, about microaggressions. And this is when the stereotypes and the implicit biases become explicit. And so Dr. Gerald Wing Sue, he is considered the father of modern microaggressions, but microaggressions was termed by Dr. Chester Pierce in the early 1970s. And they specifically talk about microaggressions as related to racial slights. But, there has been additional research that say that women can experience microaggressions. Any marginalized population or group can experience microaggressions. And so this is essentially when the stereotypes become just explicit and overt. And as I mentioned earlier, microaggressions can really add up to a lot of low self-esteem, a lot of pain, a lot of false perceptions, right? And this is part of the larger realm of disinformation and malinformation that becomes racialized. And so just in case people don't think that we don't have microaggressions in LIS, we absolutely do. I would encourage folks to check out lismicroaggressions.tumblr.com. And people are anonymously submitting the microaggressions that they endure in their libraries, in their other information organizations. And so I routinely talk about this in my classes, not only because of the folks of color that we have in our programs. We want them to be aware because we want them to be comfortable in our environment, in our profession, but also for the non people of color, because sometimes folks don't know, what they're saying. They're really relying on this implicit bias and these stereotypes, and they say things that are wildly offensive. So there is some room for education, but really this is about awareness, and be aware of how people are perceived and kind of put into boxes in our profession and in our workplace. And so, and these conversations can be difficult, right? I talk about that in class all the time, about how to have these conversations. And when people of color or folks in marginalized groups, really call out and say, listen, I don't want you to call me articulate. It's a microaggression, right? And then the person who said it will say, oh, it was just a joke. Calm down. You're being sensitive. You just misunderstood. You're overreacting. And you all you do is talk about race, right? So this is gaslighting, racial gaslighting. And gaslighting is this, it's a form of emotional abuse. And it's a way to minimize or deflect wrong behavior. And there has been a report that was put out by some academics just in the last month or so, and they're calling it race lighting. So essentially the same thing as racial gaslighting. And this is something that we need to know about as well, because some of these reactions that you see on the screen here are also just kind of, they go along with the implicit bias. And these are the types of excuses that just kind of come out. And so when I, started the talk by saying we need to be proactive, we need to be proactive on all fronts, right? So for the folks who experience this racialized disinformation and malinformation, and for the folks who are perpetuating these stereotypes, we need to be able to have these conversations and really break down what's happening. I think one of the reasons that this type of malinformation is so persistent is because people are not cognizant of it and they don't know how to address it once they become cognizant of it. All right, so I'm back to Meghan and Harry. So one of the things that Prince Harry said about the UK tabloids, he said, if the source of information is inherently corrupt or racist or biased, that filters out to the rest of society, right? So that goes back to this idea of us being socialized and conditioned with these stereotypes and this racial disinformation and malinformation. And so in one of the articles that I showed you at the top of the presentation, I wrote, when narratives are controlled by the powerful, diverse information and perspectives are omitted or even lost or not valued. And this is what we have to do, not only in our classrooms, but in our daily lives as well. And so I am suggesting, or at least this is what I'm working on in my research, is this idea of critical cultural literacy. And I am suggesting that, as a profession, we talk a lot about information literacy. We even talk about critical literacy, and critical literacy really gets at this idea that we are recognizing and addressing the various power dynamics and power structures and relationships that happen when we are providing information and receiving information. And then we have media literacy, and this is how we're addressing media and the messages that media portrays to us. And are we looking at this with a critical eye? And I'm suggesting that we take critical literacy and combine that with cultural literacy and also racial literacy and also cultural competence to be able to get this idea of critical cultural literacy. And so by doing this, we can add necessary history, we can add necessary context, we can think about the different variables, because sometimes a lot of this disinformation and malinformation happens in a vacuum, right? And so you have that negative interaction, and then it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. You weren't able to address it. The person that kind of lobbed that information at you is not corrected or addressed in the moment. And all of this is happening devoid of context, right? So think back to some of those pictures I showed you. It's possible that that woman would have gone to the Halloween party in blackface, but if I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, I'm going to suggest that she didn't know the history of blackface. Now, if she does it again, that's another issue. But just to say, we have some of these interactions and these things that are offensive and perpetuate stereotypes, but they happen because people are not aware of the history or how this would make someone else feel, or what's the context. And so by bringing these things together, hopefully we can make disinformation and malinformation and talk about it in a more nuanced fashion, so we can break some of these stereotypes down. If folks are not familiar, Allie Henney is a theologian and also a social justice advocate. And she's on Facebook and Instagram and different social media platforms. And this was one of her posts from a couple of weeks ago. And I thought it was interesting. I do really enjoy her work. I think she's a real straight talker. And I think that this is part of what we need to do. We need to be having very direct conversations when talking about racialized misinformation and disinformation. And she's breaking it down in a similar way that I have previously written about it, and thinking about if we're, talking about something like cancel culture, right? And that it's not taking away personal freedom, et cetera. But then if you have the perception of being woke or being, which I don't like woke, that's a whole other workshop. But this idea that people are aware and they're politically correct, right? That's like almost perceived as a next level, right? And she's suggesting, let's get down to even another level and talk about the systemic barriers and the systemic inequities that produce the first two. And so that goes along with what I was saying about critical cultural literacy. We have traditional literacy, then we have critical literacy, and I'm suggesting we bump it up even further to critical cultural literacy. So I have two quick examples for you as we wrap up. So let's just say African Americans and COVID-19. So we are just about to the day, the year anniversary of when most places shut down and we started isolating and working from home, et cetera. When this first happened, it was, on social media. I'm almost positive I saw it on the news. And it said that African Americans can't catch COVID-19. So I was like, woo, all right, good. But then I was like, stop it, you know better than that. And I knew it's just too good to be true, right? But again, I do this for a living. So I know that I have to go back and double check that. And it was dispelled probably the next week. But I know that there are some people who believe that because they wanted to believe it, right? And when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, another part of my work has been talking about people's emotional reactions to information and, how we tend to dismiss or disregard information that makes us angry, uncomfortable, or just doesn't jive with what we already know, right? So there are probably people who took this information and ran with it because it made them feel better, right? And then we get into particularly about COVID-19 information that has become politicized, that makes people angry and things of that nature. But all of this to say, Black and Brown populations are still disproportionately affected. But if we're talking about this particular example, once we figure out that African Americans can get COVID-19, right, and that they are suffering disproportionately, we can kind of put that into the category of traditional literacy. If we take it a step further and take this example and look at it through a critical literacy lens, we know that minority communities routinely suffer from more severely from illnesses. So it stands to reason that the same would be the case with COVID-19. And, again, think about the lack of healthcare, medical professionals thinking that people of color don't have the same pain tolerance, et cetera. So that could fall into critical literacy. So if we bump this up even further to critical cultural literacy and think about the historical context and think about the different variables and think about the different cultural norms and expectations, et cetera. Minority communities have long been predisposed to underlying conditions. Also, African Americans and other people of color have long-term trust issues with traditional medicine because of a because of a systemic lack of access to treatment, medical biases that preclude them from getting the same treatment. All right. And then, the mistrust. We have the case of Henrietta Lacks, who was essentially abused by a gynecologist who took her cells. We have the Tuskegee experiments that subjected many African-American men to syphilis well into the early 70s. So when you're hearing about vaccine resistance for COVID, there's a lot of arguments saying just take the vaccine and they're being foolish. But there's long-term generational distrust of the medical profession. So instead of saying they're just being foolish, why can't we be sensitive and understanding and cognizant of the historical context and think about, well, instead of blaming the victim, let's talk about how we can have a better PR campaign. Let's talk about how we have to have more people of color and African Americans in the medical profession, right? So they trotted out Dr. Kizzy Corbett, who was one of the doctors who developed the vaccine. She is a Black woman, right? So thinking about the entire context and ecology, as opposed to just thinking about African Americans and COVID-19 within a vacuum or a silo. All right, last example for you. Another thing with COVID-19 that was widely said was, okay, now that we're all working from home, we can just learn online, right? As if a lot of us haven't been teaching and learning online for decades, but it was brand new for a lot of people. And they thought that this was going to be a cure-all. So traditional literacy is going to say that remote learning is the solution, right? So all you have to do is have students do their work online. That's it, we're good. Critical literacy is helping us understand that not all communities or families are able to work from home because they actually lack the infrastructure and hardware to do so. So that would be our digital divide. But there's also children who have different learning styles. I have a colleague who is also LIS faculty, and her little girl has been having the hardest time. She just cannot learn online. That's just not how she absorbs information. So she's really been struggling the entire year. So that kind of falls into our critical literacy pot, if you will. And if we bump it up to critical cultural literacy, not all communities or families are able to work from home because in addition to a lack of infrastructure and hardware, they are facing job loss, a lack of income, a lack of childcare, and even a lack of technological capabilities from prior inadequate educational experiences, right? So not only can I not work from home because I don't like it, but I actually don't have Wi-Fi in my house. I don't have a computer in my house. There's lots of literature that says that particularly students of color are doing work on their smartphones, which is very different than working on a tablet or a laptop. And just that little picture there, you may have seen, these were two little girls of color that didn't have Wi-Fi or capability at their home. So they were sitting outside of Taco Bell and catching the Wi-Fi from the restaurant. And that's how they were able to get their homework done. All right, so I imagine it's been a very difficult year for them as well. All right, so I'm actually going to stop now and leave a little time for questions, but I just wanted to really spend some time with you today to talk about what I'm calling racialized or malinformation, and just think about how we are conditioned and socialized because we are repeatedly bombarded with these images and these stereotypes and these messages. And that becomes a form of malinformation. And it is a form of malinformation and disinformation that we need to be addressing and combating, just like political disinformation or any other type of disinformation that we have been talking about in the last few years. So with that, thank you so much. It has been an honor to spend some time with you, and I hope that this was useful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have questions?
I had a question. What do you say to people in the Black community who, you know, so members of the Black community who enter fields that are typically white or where they are marginalized, like take cops, for example? What do you say to the people who call them like traitors or, you know, something like that, where like they're just joining the white man? Or I don't know if I phrased that correctly, but do you understand what I'm asking?
I think so. I mean, you know, this is not to paint any one group or profession with a broad stroke and say they're all bad. I mean, I understand that, you know, people feel that way. I have police in my family, right? And, you know, when I talk about different inequities and different systemic barriers, and I give an example of how, you know, as a Black woman, even a Black woman with a PhD, I am afraid to be pulled over by the police, right? But I would also not want to be pulled over by a Black police officer either, right? So it's not to say, you know, that all police are bad, or, you know, we're in a librarianship that is predominantly white women. And I've been doing really well as a librarian for 20 plus years and, you know, as an educator. So we can't, you know, I think that's part of that nuance, and that's part of that critical cultural literacy of not just taking one profession at its face value or what you see in the media with these stereotypes, and taking it a step further and thinking about, you know, maybe it's just a segment of that population, or maybe it's just a segment of that department. And how do we deal with those people, as opposed to just kind of throwing the entire baby out with the bathwater because you have one perception, a negative perception of a group or a profession, et cetera.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, I'm just wondering what's next for Dr. Cooke. What you working on next?
Yeah, so I am continuing this work. I am currently teaching a class on news literacy. And so I'm talking about a lot of these different things that I talked to you about today. So I want to continue with that. And another big project that I'm working on is historical archival work, and working on a special issue of Libraries, Culture, History, and Society, and also a potential collection for a book collection, I should say, of Black women librarians. So telling stories in a different way, and perhaps trying to dispel some stereotypes. As I mentioned, you know, librarianship is predominantly white and female, but we have had so many librarians of color who have really paved the way for us as well. So telling those stories as well.
I have a question. First of all, Nicole, great to see you. I'm so glad you were able to do this talk for us. And I'm not sure I know exactly how to word this question, but one of the things that I've seen over and over in places like social media adds a little bit of additional complexity to the ideas of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, and that is this notion. People make the claim, they put forward a meme or they put forward some image or something, and someone points out to them, this is factually not true. You're representing something that is demonstrably untrue. And the response sometimes comes over that, well, it may not be a fact, but it still is at some deeper level a representation of what is true. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that phenomenon, if the critical cultural literacy can address that, or if there's something more challenging going on with that kind of idea.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. I think it's both. I think that is when we start talking about critical cultural literacy in combination with the understanding that people are living in a post-truth world. And post-truth says that people are essentially believing with their gut instead of their heads, right? So you could factually, because that's debatable at this point now too, people can factually know that this meme is not true, right? But there's something in their emotional response that says there's a kernel of truth here. Or maybe it's not even a kernel of truth, but it just corresponds with their previous experience or with their current beliefs, whether those current beliefs are considered right or wrong. So, I think with any type of critical instruction that we do, we're still always going to encounter people who are just willful in their beliefs, whether we think that they're correct or not. It's hard to kind of circumvent and really transcend people's emotional reactions to things. I know it obviously it can happen, but that is obvious, certainly, as you say, an added complexity when you're dealing with people's feelings and just kind of their emotional reactions instead of, them looking at this through a factual or, more academic lens. So yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly. So that is always, I think, going to be an additional challenge in this work.
We have a question in the chat from Harry Brake. Do you see school librarians being removed as a part of this malinformation, misinformation?
Being removed? You mean from the school libraries?
School librarians in their role, do you see them as being removed as a part of this malinformation, misinformation, disinformation, or do you see them playing an integral role?
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. They play an integral role. Now, it's a different scenario and different issue. And we know that this varies from state to state, whether school librarians are considered essential or whether they're removed because of budgets, et cetera. So in my mind, they're not being removed, because they don't play an important role. They're removed for other political reasons. But I think they are essential to having these conversations with our children and our students at a young age, because even, some of the pictures that I showed you, very, very young children can distinguish by skin color and race. And, they're being exposed to all types of disinformation. And we need to be having these conversations much earlier. So I think they're key. But again, there's so much more context happening in terms of whether our school librarians are in the libraries where they need to be.
There's some comments that sadly that many districts have removed school librarians or cut down or shared them amongst several schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, I just want to bring that out. Any other questions? Then I'd like to thank Dr. Cooke for being here and sharing her expertise with us. And I recorded the session. I'll be sending out the recording if I have your email. If not, you might want to send me your email address, but I'll be sending that out later today. It should be ready sometime later this afternoon, and I'll send that link out to everyone. Thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. It was great to see you all.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thanks. Hi, Kathy. Thank you.